By popular demand, let's talk about Melchizedek. So Melchizedek is a character that shows up in Genesis 14 and then becomes rhetorically important for the author of Hebrews, starting in chapter 5 all the way through chapter 7 and 8. Melchizedek in the book of Genesis is a character that Abram encounters. Abram tithes a tenth of everything that he owns. Melchizedek comes out of Salem, which is going to be associated with Jerusalem, gives out bread and wine, is a priest for El Elyon, this Canaanite high god, which then Abram takes to mean Yahweh. Then basically disappears from the scene from the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, the Tanakh. He does appear once in the Psalms, and then becomes a character in the Jewish apocalyptic apocryphal literature in the intertestamental period, so the period between the building of the Second Temple and the time of Jesus, okay, so like 500 BCE up to the time of Jesus. And then he shows up in the book of Hebrews as this, basically a reason to explain why Jesus can be considered a legitimate priest. Since Jesus is not a Levite, he comes from the tribe of Judah. For the Old Testament, the Tanakh, Melchizedek doesn't play much of a role. In Jewish thought, he is this character that serves a couple different purposes. One, it gives an excuse for the Maccabeans who set up their own priesthood to say, yes, we realize we're not Levite, but we hearken back to this even older priest. And for the author of the book of Hebrews to make a similar argument, that Jesus is a legitimate priest, not just legitimate, but even more legitimate than the Levite priesthood, because Abram himself did sacrifice for this Melchizedek priest before the Levite priesthood was even a thing. Amazingly, the author of Hebrews uses some wild interpretive choices to make her point. That in Genesis, Melchizedek doesn't have father, mother, sort of pops into the scene, is never said to die, and based off of that very shaky logic by modern standards, says see, Melchizedek is basically eternal, timeless, their priesthood never ends, they have no genealogy, Jesus is the same way. I think it shows us the flexibility that ancient authors and interpreters had, even within the pages of the New Testament, to use the Hebrew Bible to serve their theological end. The same thing is true of the Maccabeans and the ways that they use the passage. It also does sort of give this sense of mystery and legend and myth within the pages of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, that you have this character that pops in out of nowhere and never shows up again. Sort of like a Tom Bombadil, if you're familiar with The Lord of the Rings, of there's no explanation and you're not going to get one unless, future sort of legend makers fill one in for you. My point in all of this is to say that the sort of rules, regulations that we put around scripture interpretation today, they're good, they're necessary, we need them, and also ancient writers weren't using those same rules and we shouldn't expect them to. And I think it can add a bit of fun and levity and interest to see the ways that scripture was used, you could even say bent or twisted, to mean different things depending on the situation at hand. And to get so fixated on original intent, though a completely valid thing to do, wasn't the only option available to interpreters of ancient texts.